Follow Abigail's story all the way to the end. The morning she stopped trying, the house was exactly the same as it had always been. The fire was lit, the bread was on the table. The curtains in the front parlor had been drawn back at exactly 7 o'clock, the way she had drawn them every morning for 2 years. Nothing announced itself, nothing shifted. Abigail Mercer simply sat down at the breakfast table, poured herself a cup of tea, and decided very quietly that she was done. She did not cry. She had done that already, in the early months, in the small hours when the house was dark and her husband was asleep, and there was no one to see. She had used up her tears the way you use up the good candles. Carefully at first, then all at once when you stop believing they need to last. Her husband's name was Theodore Mercer. He was 31 years old, the second son of a prosperous wool merchant who had bought his way into the edges of good society and left his sons the task of climbing the rest of the way themselves. Theodore was handsome in the way that well-fed men with uncomplicated consciences often are. Broad through the shoulders, easy in his laughter, the kind of man other men liked immediately and women were expected to be grateful for. He had married Abigail because her father had 800 acres in Shropshire and a name that went back further than money. Theodore's family had the money. The arrangement made sense to everyone in the room except Abigail, and no one had thought to ask her. She had been 22. She had thought, in the way that 22-year-olds think, that love might come later. That she would earn it somehow, through patience and good management, and the slow accumulation of a life shared. She had believed this the way you believe something you have no evidence for simply because the alternative is unbearable. She had been wrong. The first time she heard Theodore describe her to his friends, she was standing on the other side of a half-open door in the library of the Calloway house, where they had been invited for a dinner that had run long and pushed the men toward the brandy and the easy confidence that brandy provides. She had come looking for her shawl. She had stopped when she heard her own name. Abigail's a good enough woman, Theodore was saying, and she could hear the particular looseness in his voice that meant he was on his third glass. Quiet, steady, no real spark to her, but that's not what you marry for, is it? She runs the house well. I suppose she's what you'd call reliable. Someone laughed. Someone else said something she couldn't hear. A burden? Theodore's voice again, lighter now, almost fond in the way that men are fond of things that require nothing from them. Not quite, but close enough. You know the type. Useful but not, you know. She did not wait to hear the rest. She went back to the dining room, found her shawl on the chair where she had left it, and sat down with the other wives and listened to a story about a horse someone's cousin had bought, and she smiled at the right moments, and no one knew. That was the night she stopped trying to make him love her. It took her another 4 months to stop trying at all. What she discovered in those 4 months was something she had not expected. That most of what she had been doing in 2 years of marriage had gone entirely unnoticed. The household ran smoothly because she made it run smoothly. The accounts balanced, the staff managed, the larder stocked, the tenants on her father's land parcels dealt with fairly, the correspondence answered, the small crises absorbed before they became large ones. Theodore moved through all of it the way a man moves through a clean room. He did not notice the cleaning. He noticed only when something was wrong. So she kept the house running. She paid the bills. She handled the letters from the estate manager in Shropshire, a capable man named Mr. Hewitt who had served her father for 20 years and now, quietly, served her. She sat across from Theodore at dinner and answered his questions in full sentences, and asked him about his day and listened to the answers. She did all of this. She simply stopped doing the other things, the small hopeful gestures, the reaching, the waiting near the window, when she heard his horse on the drive, the way she used to save up small observations during the day to tell him in the evenings, as if conversation were a gift she could offer. She stopped saving things for him. He did not notice for 6 weeks. Theodore Mercer was not a cruel man. This was perhaps the most difficult thing about him. A cruel man would have been easier to leave in her heart, easier to be angry at, easier to use as fuel for the cold decision she had already made. But Theodore was not cruel. He was simply absent, in the way that men who have never been required to be present learn to be absent, completely, and without guilt, and without any awareness that there was something they were failing to provide. He told his friends she was a burden and meant it as a mild complaint, the way you complain about weather or a slow horse. He did not mean it as a wound. It was a wound regardless. The thing that changed first was not Theodore. It was Abigail herself. She had always been quiet, but it had been the quietness of someone who was waiting. Waiting for the right moment, waiting to be asked, waiting for the warmth to break through. When she stopped waiting, the quiet became something else. It became a room of its own, with walls and a ceiling and enough air to breathe. She started writing again. She had given it up after the marriage, not because anyone asked her to, but because it seemed to belong to her old self, the self that had existed before she became Theodore's wife. And she had been trying, in those early months, to become someone who fit the life she had been given. The horse she had brought from her father's stables was a gray mare named after no one important, kept in the paddock and ridden by the groom on Tuesdays to keep her sound. Abigail reclaimed her on a Wednesday in March, rode out past the mill, and the lower field, and the long stretch of common land where the village boys flew kites in summer, and came back an hour later with mud on her boots and something unclenched in her chest. The groom said nothing. The mare had been glad to see her. She began going to the lending library in the village on Friday afternoons. She began accepting invitations to call on Mrs. Holroyd, the rector's wife, who was sharp and funny, and had opinions about everything, and was not at all interested in performing contentment. She began spending Thursday mornings at the schoolroom her father had established on the Shropshire land, where a young teacher named Miss Fenn was doing remarkable things with 27 children, and not enough books. Abigail donated the books. Then she donated a stove. Then she wrote 3 letters to men in London who might care about rural education if properly approached, and 2 of them wrote back. She did not tell Theodore about any of it, not from spite, simply because she had stopped assuming he would want to know. The afternoon she laughed, really laughed, the way she used to laugh before the marriage. She was standing at the edge of the Holroyd garden with the rector's youngest son, a boy of 7 named George, who had discovered a frog and was delivering a very serious lecture on its habits. The laugh came out of her before she could shape it into something more appropriate. It was loud and entirely genuine, and she clapped a hand over her mouth afterward, surprised at herself, the way you are surprised when you find something you had stopped looking for. Theodore was passing on the road above. He heard it. She did not know he had heard it until that evening, when he came to the dinner table earlier than usual, and sat looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not displeasure, something closer to confusion. He asked her how her afternoon had been. She said it had been pleasant. He waited, as if expecting more, and when she offered nothing further, he picked up his fork and said after a moment, "You seem well." "I am," she said, "thank you." He looked at her again. Then he looked at his plate. She did not know what he was seeing. She suspected he was not sure himself. The letter came in April. It came from a firm of solicitors in London, and it was addressed to Theodore, and she knew what it was before he opened it because she had been managing the household accounts long enough to understand the shape of their situation better than he did. The Mercer family's money was older than it appeared. The wool trade had softened in the last decade, and Theodore's older brother had borrowed against the family's interests in ways that had not been disclosed at the time of the marriage. The estate in Shropshire, her father's land, her land, was not in question, but the Mercer properties were. The London house, the partnership in the mill at Darnfield, the investments that had been described to her father as sound. Theodore opened the letter at the breakfast table. He read it twice. He set it down. He said, "There may be some difficulties." Abigail said, "I know." He looked up at her. "I've known since January," she said. "I spoke with Mr. Hewitt, and with Mr. Calloway's solicitor, who was kind enough to explain the situation in terms that were useful. I have some thoughts, if you would like to hear them." Theodore was very still. "You spoke with a solicitor?" "Several," she said. "I found it clarifying." He did not speak for a long moment. Outside, the wind was doing something to the elm tree that made a sound like water. "What thoughts?" he said at last. She told him. She had been arranging it in her mind for 3 months. The consolidation of the Shropshire rents, the renegotiation of the Darnfield partnership, the letter she had already drafted to a textile merchant in Manchester, who was looking to expand and who had capital and no particular attachment to the Mercer name or its complications. She laid it out plainly, without sentiment, the way Mr. Hewitt had taught her to think about land and money when she was 16, and her father had been too ill to manage things himself, and someone had needed to learn. When she finished, Theodore was looking at her the way you look at something you have walked past every day without seeing and have finally, for some reason you cannot name, stopped to examine. "How long have you known how to do this?" he said. "Always," she said, and poured herself more tea. The months that followed were not simple. Theodore hired his own solicitor, a man named Briggs, who was expensive and well-regarded, and who arrived at their home in early May with a leather case and an air of authority that collapsed entirely within 40 minutes of meeting Abigail, at which point he began directing his questions primarily to her. Theodore noticed this. He sat in the corner of the room and watched his wife dismantle a financial problem that had seemed immovable, and something in his expression shifted by degrees, the way light shifts in a room when a cloud passes. She did not look at him to see if he was watching. She had stopped performing for him. She went to Shropshire in June to oversee the renegotiation of the northern rents in person. She took her mare, a traveling case, and Mrs. Fenn, who had turned out to be a useful correspondent and was willing, for the summer, to serve as a companion. She left Theodore a note with the household schedule and the name of the wine merchant who was to be paid on Thursday, and the information that the third step on the back staircase had been loose for a fortnight and would become dangerous if not addressed. She was gone for 6 weeks. Theodore addressed the step on the second day. He wrote to her 3 times. She answered once, briefly, regarding a practical matter about the Darnsfield rents. He had not written to her in 2 years of marriage. She read his letters and felt nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer. She came back in August. The house smelled different when she entered. Not badly, only differently, the way a room smells when the habits that hold it in a particular shape have been disrupted. Theodore was in the study. He came out when he heard the door and stood in the hallway and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. He was thinner, slightly. He had the look of a man who has been left alone with his own thoughts for long enough to become uncomfortable with them. "You're back," he said. "I am," she said. He said, "The step has been fixed. I see that." A silence, not the old silence which had been the silence of 2 people with nothing to say to each other, something else, a silence with weight in it. "I went to the Callaway dinner," he said. "Last month. Phillips asked after you. That was kind of him," he said. Theodore stopped, started again. "He said he hadn't realized you were involved in the school at Alderton. Miss Fenn spoke about it. Apparently you've corresponded with people in Parliament." 2 members, she said. "One was not particularly interested. The other was." Theodore looked at her. "I didn't know that." "No," she said. "You didn't." She went upstairs to change her dress and left him standing in the hallway. The understanding between them came slowly, and not in the way she had once hoped it would come. There was no single moment, no declaration, no dramatic reversal that she could point to afterward and say, "That was when things changed." There was only a gradual accumulation, the way a room gradually fills with light when the sun moves. Theodore began appearing at the breakfast table earlier. He began asking questions. Not the performative questions of a man going through the motions of interest, but the slightly awkward questions of someone who is genuinely uncertain of the answer and has decided, for reasons he hasn't fully examined, that this particular uncertainty matters. He asked about the school. She told him. He asked about the Manchester merchant. She explained the arrangement. He asked, one evening in September, sitting across from her in the drawing room, with a book he had not been reading, whether she had been unhappy. The question sat in the air between them. "For a long time," she said. "Yes." He looked at his hands. "I said something," he said. "At Callaway's. 2 years ago, I think. I think you were there. In the house. I didn't know." She waited. "It wasn't what I meant," he said. "Or it was what I meant in the moment, which is worse, I think. I'd had too much to drink and I was performing, the way men do, and it was easier to make you small than to admit that I didn't know how to, that I had never." He stopped. "I don't have a good explanation." "I know," she said. "I'd like to try," he said, "if that is something you would consider. I understand if it isn't." She looked at him for a long moment. The man across from her was not the man she had married. Or perhaps he was. And what had changed was that she could now see both what he had been and what he was capable of becoming, and those 2 things were not the same. "I'm not the woman I was when we married either," she said. "No," he said. "You're considerably more alarming." It was the first time she had ever heard him say something that surprised her. She nearly smiled. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's what I can offer," he said. "That's more than I deserve." "Yes," she said. "It is." The harvest ball at the Alderton Assembly Rooms was held every year in the 3rd week of October, and it was the kind of event that the whole of the county treated as an accounting of who had prospered, who had declined, who had married well or badly or not at all, who had done something interesting with their summer. It was the event at which reputations were confirmed or revised. Abigail had attended it every year since her marriage in the particular role of Theodore Mercer's quiet wife, which was to say she had stood near the windows and smiled and been noted and forgotten. She had never minded this before because she had still been waiting, back then, for things to be different. This year, she was not waiting for anything. She arrived with Theodore, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she arrived in conversation with Miss Fenn and with Mrs. Holroyd, and with a woman named Mrs. Ashworth, who was the wife of the Member of Parliament who had, as it turned out, been interested after all. There were things to discuss. There were plans that had moved forward over the summer, and arrangements that required the kind of attention that makes a person stand differently, take up more space, finish their sentences without looking around, to see if anyone minds. Theodore stood slightly to her left, and did not for once lead the conversation. People noticed. The moment she would remember came near the end of the evening. The music had paused between sets, and Theodore had gone to fetch her a glass of something cold, and she was standing with Mrs. Holroyd when she became aware that the room had shifted slightly in the particular way. Rooms shift when something is about to be said publicly. She turned and saw Theodore, glass in hand, standing near the small raised platform where the musicians sat, speaking to a cluster of men she recognized. Calloway among them, and Phillips, and two others who had been at that dinner 2 years ago on the other side of the door. "I owe a correction," Theodore said, and his voice was steady enough that the people nearest him went quiet and the quiet spread. "I said something at this man's table 2 years ago about my wife that I have been ashamed of since I understood what I had said. I said she was reliable. I said she was close enough to a burden." He paused. That was the estimation of a man who had not yet looked at what was directly in front of him. "Mrs. Mercer has, in the past year, renegotiated our family's financial situation, established a school that has since been cited in Parliament, corresponded with 3 members of the legislature, and persuaded 2 of them, managed 2 estates simultaneously, and done all of it without asking me to notice or approve." Another pause. "I am asking all of you to notice, and I am asking her to forgive me, if she is so inclined, publicly, because the error was public." The room was very quiet. Abigail looked at her husband across the width of the assembly room, and she thought about the woman who had stood on the other side of a library door, and walked away without her shawl, and sat down with the other wives, and smiled at the right moments. She thought about the morning she had poured her tea and decided she was done. She crossed the room to him. She did not take his arm, not yet. That would come later, or it would not, and either way she would be all right, because she knew now that she would be all right. She was no longer a woman who required rescue. She was a woman who had, in the quiet and unremarkable course of an ordinary life, rescued herself. She stood beside him and said quietly, so that only he could hear, "You should have led with the Parliament part." Theodore Mercer laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, and the sound of it did something unexpected to the room, and to her, and to the long careful space between them that had begun, imperceptibly, to close.